I've made a handful of videos centering around historic lost media. This genre of lost media is particularly interesting to me. Stuff that's been missing for tens, hundreds, or maybe even thousands of years. Throughout the making of this video, I've accrued a handful of topics that didn't quite make it into their own respective videos. Rather, there wasn't a whole lot to discuss, or they got cut for time, or whatever else. But today, that's what we're covering. A list of lost media topics that have some sort of historical significance, but didn't make it into their own video. So now, they have their own. Here's 20 pieces of historic lost media. If there's one thing on YouTube I've been mocked relentlessly for, it's my pronunciations, and I swear it's not on purpose. I'm just stupid, and one of my pet peeves on YouTube is when someone is reading a script and they say, "I'm not even gonna try and pronounce that." I find it incredibly disrespectful, so all of my efforts are honest. All of that is to say, Ayastefanos'taki Rus Abidesinin Yıkılışı, Turkish for Demolition of the Russian Monument at San Stefano, was a documentary film widely believed to be created on November 14th, 1914. The title is exactly what the film consisted of: the Ottoman Empire armies destroying a Russian monument. Said monument was literally named the Russian Monument at San Stefano. It wasn't given a cool name. The monument was a chapel built in Istanbul, the former capital, but at the time, capital of the Ottoman Empire, which is modern-day Turkey. Did all of that make sense? The monument was constructed over a period of 3 years between 1895 and 1898. It was built to honor the Russian soldiers who died in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877. The monument was huge, and it was built over an area of 6 acres. The bodies of the soldiers who did lose their lives were buried here, under the tower. On the interior, the main entrance had portraits of Jesus Christ, Vladimir the Great, and Alexander Nevsky. The monument was finished in 1898, but 16 years later, it was destroyed. On November 14th, 1914, the Ottoman Empire entered World War I against Russia, and their first move was to destroy the monument. The demolition was carried out by Ismaili Enver Pasha, and he ordered a man named Fuat Yusufkane to film said demolition. The film has not been seen since, but it was said to be a recording of the chapel before, during, and after the demolition. While the film has never been seen, pictures have survived, which calls into question whether or not there was an actual video recording taken. The last report of the film comes from a man who worked with Fuat Yusufkane, Gafuri Akakin. He claimed that the recording was mixed in with other archival footage and was taken to the new Turkish capital of Ankara, but it was lost in the transport. This was in 1941, and almost 100 years later, we have no footage from this lost historical film. Robert Hooke was a British scientist who is best well known for discovering cellular structure. However, he was accomplished in many other areas: in architecture, astronomy, geology, and meteorological studies. He even helped rebuild a big portion of London after the Great Fire of 1666. And the pictures you're looking at on screen is not him. This was a portrait painted in 1680 by Mary Beale, and it's titled Portrait of a Mathematician. But again, the man in the photo is not known. But it is commonly thought to be Robert Hooke, but we have no idea what Robert Hooke looked like. Of course, cameras weren't around yet. The method to capture appearance in this time was through portraits, and no portrait has survived. But it's likely he had one done, and it was destroyed. We turn our attention over to this man, Sir Isaac Newton, the man who discovered the idea of gravity. And Hooke helped him with these theories, but this help later evolved into arguments over their work and contributions. They also accused one another of plagiarism, claiming the other stole the other's idea of gravity. Overall, they were feuding, which leads to the conspiracy that Isaac Newton may have destroyed the only portrait of Robert Hooke. Hooke died on March 3rd, 1703, and Newton lived for another 24 years, passing away in 1727. We do know that a portrait of Hooke existed once upon a time, as German scholar Zacharias Uffenbach visited the British Royal Society in 1710 and was shown portraits of Robert Boyle and Hooke. However, this is the only mention of a portrait ever existing, and it hasn't been seen since. This brings up the idea that Newton had something to do with it. Once Hooke died, Newton became the president of the Royal Society and he moved their base of operations. And people believe Newton either trashed the portrait, had it left behind, or it was completely innocently lost in transit. Thanks to whatever happened, we have no idea what Hooke looked like, save for descriptions of him in his later life. In May of 1915, the RMS Lusitania was headed from New York to London. At the same time, World War I was raging, and the German Navy announced complete and total submarine warfare against all British ships. So without any warning, the Lusitania was struck by a torpedo off the coast of Ireland and it was sank. Out of the 1,960 people on board, 1,197 perished. This was the catalyst for the United States to finally consider military action against Germany and their allies in World War I. And 2 years later, the first American boots touched down in France. But if we back up to the actual Lusitania sinking, there were pieces of documentation lost in the actual incident. On board the ship were two wireless operators, Robert Leaf and David McCormick. McCormick is the one we're concerned with. The two remained on the ship for as long as they could, but as the water reached them, they left. McCormick had with him a pocket camera that he managed to snap a ton of photos with. Today, we only have 5. The first 2 were taken about a half an hour before the torpedo struck, so they were developed and saved. But picture number 3 is a bit harder to discern. Many people think it's a crowd escaping the deck, but it's kinda hard to figure out. The 4th photo is a gray blob, and the 5th photo shows a figure floating on a lifeboat. And picture number 6 is the most famous one, showing parts of the ship floating in the water. They were all taken on the deck of the Lusitania, but they are the only part of what was captured. McCormick took tons of photos, but unfortunately, the emulsion of the negatives was ruined when he reached the water, destroying any other photos that could have survived the Lusitania. But to end the story on a positive note, both Robert Leaf and David McCormick survived the crash. Every 10 years in America, the United States government holds their census. This is a nationwide counting of every person in the country, across all 50 states and the outside territories. The first ever United States Census was conducted in 1790 by then Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. Since then, the nation has had 24 censuses, and the most recent one was in April of 2020, and the next one will be on April 1st, 2030. One of the primary reasons the census is held is, yes, get a population headcount for the entire country, but this data is then used for its main purpose, redistricting the House of Representatives. Let me quickly explain. The United States Congress is divided into 2 branches, the Senate and the House. The Senate is simple. Each state gets 2 senators. The House is a little more complicated. States are divided into congressional districts based off of how many people live there. In total, there are 435 seats in the House of Representatives, an arbitrary number that has increased over the years, but has remained stuck since 1913. Because of this, these district spots are constantly reshuffled since there's a limited amount of spots, which again is where the census comes in. The districts are redrawn and reassigned based off the census, which affects the Electoral College, which affects American elections as a whole, but we are a little off topic. Let's back up. We're discussing lost media today. And one of the American censuses is missing. The 1890 census was held on June 2nd, 1890, and determined that Illinois, Pennsylvania, and New York were the most populated states, while Idaho, Wyoming, and Nevada were the least populated. However, we can't view this information ourselves because it was burnt. In January of 1921, a fire at the U.S. Department of Commerce building broke out. A man named James Foster saw smoke coming through the building's elevator, but did not see a fire, so he determined it was coming from the basement. After evacuating the building and getting a team down to the basement, they saw the damage was pretty much done, and a lot of the archives there were torched. This is what happened to the 1890 census. It was determined that 25% of the report was completely torched, with an additional 50% damaged by smoke, embers, and water damage from the firefight. Other censuses were damaged, including the 1830, 40, 80, and 1910s, but the 1890 had it the worst. To this day, it's not known what caused the fire, and 20 years after it, by congressional approval, the remnants of the 1890 census were completely destroyed, meaning nothing from that data survives today, save for the aforementioned final counts. Metropolis is a film released in 1927, and it was directed by Fritz Lang. The movie takes place in a futuristic Germany, and it's a film all about class. The richest of the city live on top of skyscrapers, while the workers live underground, operating the machines that power the city. While it wasn't really well received at release, it got its flowers as time moved on, recognizing how important of a film it was, especially being created when film was still a decently new concept. When the film was released, it ran for 2.5 hours, 153 minutes. But for international releases, the film was chopped down, and a search for a complete copy is still underway. As it stands today, we have 143 out of the 153 minutes of film, so 10 minutes of Metropolis are missing. The original cut from the film was 116 minutes, and more parts of this cut was found in the 70s and 80s. A big part of it was found in 2008, where it was just sitting in a film archive in Buenos Aires, Argentina. After restoring the damaged scenes here, we had a mostly complete Metropolis, save for that same 10 minutes. But also in these damaged scenes, there were 2 scenes beyond saving. One featured a monk preaching to his chapel, and another one featured a fight between 2 main characters, Rotwang and Fredersen. However, the film is now almost a century old, and we should consider ourselves lucky we have any of it left. Most silent films are completely gone, so it's a good thing Metropolis did not suffer the same fate. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, one of the most famous works of horror to ever be written. Of course, it follows Dr. Henry Jekyll and his alter ego, Mr. Hyde, who is a cruel, violent, downright evil version of the Doctor. The story was written back in 1886, and it still remains popular and important to this day. I mean, come on, he was the Nick Fury of the Dark Universe.
My name is Jekyll, Dr. Henry Jekyll.
But for as important as this story may be, we almost didn't have it. The story was written by Robert Louis Stevenson. His wife, Fanny Stevenson, had problems with the book, so she burnt it. The original manuscript for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was burnt and destroyed. This is because Fanny had problems with the book. First of all, at this point, Louis was a bit of a failed writer, and his wife was encouraging him to seek other employment venues. However, one night, Louis woke up screaming, and his wife was like, "What the hell is wrong with you?" And he bolts out of bed, saying he had a nightmare and he's going to make it into a story. So, he started writing what would become the first draft of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Like he'd usually do, he read the first draft to his wife, who wasn't impressed. And this is where the story splits. Version 1 says Fanny herself burned the story, as she didn't like it, thought it was horrible, clear the board, start over. But version 2 says Louis himself burned it, upon realizing the criticisms his wife had were legit. So he started over. Regardless of who burnt the original manuscript, Louis spent the next 3 days writing 30,000 words, 10K a day, before he had the final version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, while the first version was reduced to simple atoms of carbon. It should be expected that for a book as old as the Bible, some parts of it would go missing. Most of these books are still readable, but were simply omitted from the canon of the Bible. There are 17 that fit this description. However, the following entry is a book written for the Bible, but wasn't preserved in modern versions of the text. The book is 0 Corinthians, written by Paul, one of the apostles. In 51 AD, Paul founded the Church of Corinth, located at one of the largest cities in ancient Greece. After about 3 years, Paul returned from his missionary work and saw that the church had strayed greatly from his teachings. This prompted him to write a collection of letters to the church, calling out these practices. These letters, the ones that survived, were 1st and 2nd Corinthians. However, in 1 Corinthians, on verse 9 of chapter 5, Paul references a previous letter he had written. "I wrote to you in my epistle not to keep company with sexually immoral people. The idea of sexual immorality is mentioned later in 1 Corinthians, leading scholars to believe that 0 Corinthians was mostly themed around this idea. Whatever this letter contained, we can only speculate, as nothing from it has survived. Again, should 0 Corinthians be found, it will join the ranks as one of the oldest pieces of Christian writings. We're going to get a little gross with this one. If you're eating, maybe skip it. A few weeks back, my entire TikTok For You page was taken over by abandoned supermarkets. These places packed full of food, left to rot in the sun for days, weeks, or maybe even months. Of course, the best well-known case of this happening is the Mexia Supermarket, a grocery store that was in Fort Worth, Texas. First opened in 1998, the store was funded with a loan that would be paid off over 15 years. However, the store wasn't turning a profit, and their loans were not paid at all. Therefore, just a year into the store's operation, the owners abandoned it. This was in the summertime, and again, it was in Texas, one of the hottest parts of the United States. A few weeks into the store's abandonment, the electric was shut off, and now, the Mexia Supermarket became a ticking time bomb of biological horror. The store was filled with meat, dairy, and produce, and of course, it all began to rot. The interior of the place was filled with toxic gases that began to seep into the exterior, leading to complaints being filed. Fort Worth officials were soon on scene when they found the mess waiting for them. The area was crawling with rats, both on the inside and outside. Inside the store, the walls of flies were so thick that cleaners couldn't see their hands in front of them. Meat was rotted and turned into a dark gray goo. Fruits and vegetables had gnaw marks on them from rats, and said rats had lost their lives due to the sheer amount of bacteria and disease swirling in the air. All of this is to say, the store was disgusting, and it needed to be clean. This was a several month-long process, which finally came to a conclusion on November 30th. This was mostly known solely to the people of Fort Worth, until the program Life After People mentioned it, and included footage of the market, leading to its popularity to the masses. From here, people have searched for the full tapes of the walkthrough of Mexia Supermarket. Other lost media YouTubers have reached out to Fort Worth officials inquiring for a full copy of the tape, but one has never been given, and it's likely these tapes weren't digitized, meaning the full walkthrough of the Mexia Supermarket is gone. I originally wanted to do a full deep dive onto the Mexia Supermarket for a video in October, but by this point, I feel it's overdone. But if you would like to see the Tan Man's spin on it, let me know. Also, we mentioned earlier that the building was infested with rats, so they didn't burn it down. The building is still standing today, and it's in use. It's now a Dollar General. The perfect, most fitting fate for the Mexia Supermarket. Did you know the Iliad and the Odyssey, the two epic Greek poems written by Homer, are only 2 chapters out of a massive story? There are 8 chapters in total, making up what's known as the epic cycle, with the other 6 being missing. In order, they are as follows: the Cypria, the Iliad, Aethiopis, Little Iliad, Sack of Troy, Nostoi, the Odyssey, and Telogony. You might have known about all of that, but for the Iliad itself, there is another written piece that is missing: the Dilliad. This was a parody of the original text, written by the Greek comedian Nikochares. He was one of the Athenian poets who contributed to Old Comedy, a style of writing which little of survives, including the Dilliad. Unfortunately, we know nothing about the poem, and we only know it existed thanks to Aristotle, who mentioned it a single time. Divorced, beheaded, and died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. We're discussing one of the most famous British monarchs to ever serve, King Henry VIII. In 1536, Henry employed a man named Hans Holbein, and a year later, he painted this. This is the most famous portrait of King Henry VIII. If I say his name, this is what you're gonna picture. But this was only part of the full picture, and here's the entire thing. It has Henry, wife number 3, Jane Seymour, and his parents. The original mural hung in the chambers of Whitehall Palace for 162 years. Several prints and copies were made of the thing, but the original would be destroyed in a fire that tore through the palace, completely destroying the original. This leaves us with only the copies made and an original sketch made by Hans. Zheng He was a Chinese admiral who commanded several major voyages across the Asian continent. He was born in 1371 and his death date isn't fully agreed to. We'll get to that later. Like we said, he conducted 7 massive fleets across the Asian continent, and his exploits took him to places like Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, and even as far as the Horn of Africa. However, this is just the expeditions we know of, as a lot of Zheng He's history was covered up upon his death. There are 2 death dates listed for him, one stating he died in 1433, the other says 1435. The first one claims he died shortly after his 7th voyage, but another one says he lived for 2 years post his 7th voyage, passing away then. Regardless, he was given a tomb in China, but was buried at sea. After his death, a lot of his maps were saved and published, but a handful of them were destroyed by his rivals trying to discredit his name. This was done to minimize his effects on the naval history of China. As we said, he charted this area of the world. However, some people believe that these other maps that were torched expand outwards. Some people believe Zheng He might have made it to Australia, West Africa, or even as far as the Americas. He was a very accomplished sailor and had one of the largest fleets with possibly the largest made ships of the time. I guess anything is possible. Here's something you don't hear often. My favorite holiday is New Year's. Genuinely, I love the New Year's season. To me, it always feels like a nice, fresh, clean slate. Until you get a week into the new year and it really sets in, holy shit, it's 2025, Age of Ultron is 10 years old now. I always watch the ball drop on New Year's Eve, mostly because I like hearing theme from New York live. Coverage for New Year's is certainly not new, and we're going to discuss one of the oldest pieces of live New Year's broadcasts. It takes us to December of 1922, heading into January of 1923. We're in the United Kingdom, where BBC radio station 2ZY is hosting a program. The BBC was actually founded in this same year, when 6 independent radio companies came together in a joint operation, deciding that radio required such a team-up. 2ZY was one of these companies to join the BBC, and they were the ones in charge of the New Year's cast. The show started at 10:15 local time, and it featured a various set of gramophone recordings leading up to the actual New Year's event. Once the new year arrived, the national anthem was played, followed by a segment called A Happy New Year and Good Morning. All of this is missing. Radio was in its infancy, and saving radio broadcast wasn't even a thought yet, leading this New Year's celebration as completely lost with no hopes of recovery. Between the years of 1829 and 1838, a Polish writer by the name of Adam Mickiewicz wrote a series of manuscripts. They were predictions for the future, appropriately called Historia Przyszłości, Polish for History of the Future. Several versions of these writings were made, but most of them were burned at the urging of his friends. We still know a few of his predictions, and ones he got right, and ones he got wrong. He predicted the television. He predicted balloons that could take people to other planets by the year 2000. He also predicted total peace in Europe by 1899. His predictions were all over the place. But like we said, most of these texts were burnt after his friends read them, making one really wonder what he really predicted. One of the most famous piece or pieces of historical lost media is the Library of Alexandria. These ancient texts that were destroyed in a massive fire. But this event is a little overrated. By the time the fire destroyed the library, most of the texts inside were already copied for preservation. However, other ancient libraries were destroyed by multiple means, and they are not as nearly covered as the Library of Alexandria. Case in point, the National Library of Sweden. This was established in 1661, and just 8 years later, in 1669, a massive fire tore through the building. Here, 17,286 volumes of text, alongside 1,103 manuscripts, were stored. The fire destroyed 10,586 of these volumes, alongside 820 manuscripts, with no hopes of them ever being recovered. However, the Swedish Library continued to grow after this fire, and no other massive fires wiped it out. The Veritable Records of the Joseon Dynasty is a compilation of 1,893 volumes that chronicle the entire time of the Joseon Dynasty of Korea. This was something compiled from 1392 to 1895, a period of 473 years. Again, leading to the astronomical count of 1,893 volumes. These counts were archived by historians who would follow the kings every day, documenting how their time was spent. This was an important process, and none of the kings of the Joseon Dynasty would do business without a historian with them. This leads to some incidents being documented that the kings would later ask to be taken out. Probably the best well-known example was in Volume 7 of Taejong. I'll read from it. The king himself rode a horse and shot arrows at a deer. However, the horse stumbled, causing him to fall off, but he was not injured. Looking around, he said, "Do not let the historians write this down." This goes to show that these records were complete, with no form of bias. It was a simple day journal that lasted all throughout the Joseon Dynasty. But we're in a lost media video, so parts of it are missing. Starting in 1445, 53 years after their compilation began, 3 additional copies of the text were created. This has led to most of them being preserved, even through the dangerous history of the Korean continent. Even before this, though, we look to 1600, when the documents are being moved. A government official named Kwon Tali found that the copy listed as Volume 11 actually held the contents of Volume 9 in a documentation mistake. This has led to the actual Volume 11, consisting of data between December 1451 to February of 1452, to be missing. Leonardo da Vinci is one of the most famous artists to ever put brush on canvas, and we will discuss one of his missing paintings. It's also one of his earliest paintings, and what we know of it comes from autobiographies. Its earliest surviving mention comes from the 1568 book Vita di Leonardo. Then, having prepared it for painting, he began to think what he could paint upon it that would frighten everyone who saw it, having the effect of the head of Medusa. So he brought for this purpose to his room, which no one entered but himself, lizards, grasshoppers, serpents, butterflies, locusts, bats, and other strange animals of the kind. And from them, all he produced a great, an animal so horrible and fearful that it seemed to poison the air with its fiery breath. So he was setting out to make a realistic painting that would terrify people. And it's again mentioned in 1782 by Luigi Lanzi in a book detailing paintings listed at the Uffizi Gallery. Finally, on the following wall, one sees the head of Medusa with serpents so realistic that it makes credible what we read of Vinci. Where in a painting produced like this, which one saw fear and fled, something that does no less honor to modern painting than did the grapes of Zeusis or the horses of Apelles. The grapes of Zeusis is a funny mention. It's another missing painting that this guy Zeusis entered into a contest with another painter to determine who the most realistic painter was. Zeusis' grapes were so realistic that birds came down to eat them, and then he told the other painter to reveal his artwork, which was covered in curtains, only for him to reveal that the curtains were his paintings. Bit off topic. This painting was well documented, but there isn't any hint as to where it ended up. Whether it's in a private collection somewhere, it was destroyed, or it disappeared for any other reason. Margaret Fuller was an American writer and journalist who set the early stages of feminism. In 1846, the New York Tribune sent her to Italy to report on the situation unfolding over there, where she first meets Giuseppe Mazzini, whom she allied with. She supported his idea of a Roman Republic, a short-lived period of Italian history, which Margaret documented in full. She claimed it to be her most important work ever done, but we are unable to read it today. When coming back home to America in 1850, Fuller's ship capsized, and she, her husband, and her children all perished. The book was on this shipwreck, and it was never recovered, same as the bodies of all who lost their lives. We're discussing more history of the BBC. They began their television service on November 2nd, 1936. 3 years after this, World War II began, and the BBC suspended all television service. This wouldn't resume until June 7th, 1946. So for nearly 7 years, the television service was out of the country, save for 2 broadcasts. The BBC had their broadcast from the Alexandra Palace. This was an area built in 1875, and it's still standing today. Following the shutdown of the BBC service, 2 broadcasts were held privately at the Alexandra Palace. The first one was in August of 1943, and the other one was in February of 1945. We will start with the 1943 one, as it's much more mysterious, and it was the first one to take place. This broadcast wasn't noted in the BBC's written archive or public record office, and the only reason we know of it is due to engineer Desmond Campbell, who took notes of the production. It was also listed in the archives of Alexandra Palace itself. Whatever was discussed here, it left archivist Simon Vaughn upset, but he signed an NDA and further details were not given. The 1945 broadcast is much more well known, and we will discuss it now. The program lasted for 40 minutes and it was a variety show, showing off actresses, singers, and other programs of the BBC. Due to the exclusivity of the events and the infancy of TV preservation, both broadcasts are gone for good. And finally, we reached the last entry for today's video, the Memoirs of Lord Byron. He was an English poet who passed away on April 16, 1824 at the young age of 36. Upon his death, he had finished a set of memoirs, which were burnt by his literary executors, including his publisher, John Murray. This was done to protect his reputation, as Byron was a bisexual man, and fears that this would ruin him were present, prompting the aforementioned burning, leading to us missing out on a large part of his life.